Council of Senior Centers and Services is best known for its advocacy and policy work. We've been doing this for many decades. And 5 years ago, the city attempted to eliminate all elder abuse funding from the Department for the Aging through community-based providers. And so we really kicked into gear and managed to get City Council to keep funding the elder abuse. And every year we had to fight for the same money over and over. That's what they call the budget dance. So you can't make progress. You're lucky if you get what you had. And as we entered the elder abuse arena, we got more drawn in and saw the depth of the problems, the challenges, but also a remarkable network of professionals that have been working in the elder abuse world, whatever their point, their angle is in it, their piece of it, for decades. Mm-hmm. And so we also saw that there was no group that could bring together a coalition to do advocacy. There were great coalitions out there, but not to do advocacy, not to sign letters. They couldn't sign letters. They couldn't go to elected officials. They couldn't raise awareness of cuts and the impact of cuts. And so that's us. That's what we do. There was a space there, and we said, let's bring people together and find out, what are the issues and how can we organize them. And in a sense, we're the cover, we're the coalition. We can bring groups together to then, whether it's fighting for budget cuts or advocating for new money or trying to get legislation passed. And that's exactly what we've been doing. We've filled that space of advocacy and policy for elder abuse that we didn't see other groups doing.
Mm-hmm. And more specifically, are there specific things you're advocating for elder abuse victims, or for the services provided for elder abuse?
Our elder abuse agenda has become pretty full. And so what we advocate for is everything from funding for programs to legislation to protect elder abuse victims. Mostly right now we're working on legislation to protect financial elder abuse victims. We've met with the New York Police Department in terms of helping them insert training for the police on how to deal better with elder abuse victims, be more appropriate and understanding. And so we keep building out the agenda, and again, we're informed very often by people in the field that have told us these are the issues and the challenges. We've just this year did our 4th annual World Elder Abuse Awareness Day press conference at City Hall, which now has become a regular event every year, and that raises the awareness of elder abuse as well.
And how do you view the advocacy you're doing in elder abuse in comparison's not the right word, when you look at the child abuse,
right,
the
domestic violence
model?
The domestic violence world, it has done wonderful things for domestic violence survivors. They have a lot to do yet. Of course, unfortunately, we know DV is still with us. So we have tried, first of all, to collaborate with domestic violence coalitions so that elder abuse becomes integrated, even though we recognize there's particular skills with dealing with elder abuse victims. We get that, but to be part of that world. So when it gets said that elder abuse is 20 or 30 years behind domestic violence, what that means to me as an advocate is we don't have the programs, or the funding for programs, we don't have policies in place that are sensitive to elder abuse victims, and we don't have legislation, adequate legislation to protect elder abuse victims, which is why we're working on a state bill to protect financial elder abuse victims. So how do we begin to fill the space? I mean, when we say there's a space there, that's what's missing now. And so how do we work on these different areas within the wider elder abuse arena and move forward? And I think we have a lot to learn from the domestic violence community, and so we're trying to learn, but again, move ahead in a particular way as well.
When you're talking about a space, what are you talking about?
It's a space is like a vacuum.
Right, but where is the vacuum?
So the vacuum initially was that there was no group that was in a position to do advocacy and policy for elder abuse, and that's what we do. So that was the first vacuum, okay? The next vacuum was once we got into elder abuse advocacy, what do we mean by it? What were we going to concentrate on? And so we, again, in collaboration with colleagues who identified the issues, we now concentrate on funding city and state level for elder abuse victim services. We concentrate on state legislation to protect financial elder abuse victims. We've had meetings with the New York Police Department to help educate them for training of police to be more sensitive to elder abuse victims. And so that's space, that's vacuum. You know, how do we identify what's not being done, and how do we move forward in that way?
And as we were talking, you mentioned ageism a couple of times in different topics that we talked about. So is that something that you contribute, you know, this vacuum for, or why the advocacy is kind of behind domestic violence? And if you can start off in a complete sentence.
Right. We do a lot of work on ageism and bring it into many of our discussions and advocacy that we do, and in particular with elder abuse, because I think at the foundation of elder abuse is ageism. I mean, I think they're sort of part and parcel of the same thing, taking advantage and harming people, you know, due to their age and vulnerability. Ageism, like any other ism, is very insidious. You can't always see it. It's part of society. We live and we breathe it. And we don't yet have a safe space to talk about ageism. That's my view. When the civil rights movement started, blacks had to create a space for themselves, even though whites pushed back. Women had to do it when feminism and sexism, even though men pushed back. Gays had to do it with homophobia, even though straight people pushed back. We don't have that space to talk about ageism because very often what happens right away, somebody says, well, what about young people? And that shuts down the conversation. So how do we create a space that says, we just need a space to talk and raise the issues of how getting to a certain age impacts somebody's life? And so how does that impact policy decisions? How does that impact political leadership where they put their funding? Are old people worth investing in? They're old. You know, do they have a future? Well, yes, everybody has a future, but is it seen that way? And that really has everyday ramifications, and not just on the political level, you know, walking down the street, living your life. I mean, it has very I'm sorry, I can't think of the word. But every day of your life, I'm sorry?
Ramifications.
Every day of your life, if you're not treated properly, if you're not taken seriously, then it has its ramifications. And in elder abuse, what I've heard is that sometimes the police don't treat the older adult seriously when they come and, you know, for a complaint, even as far as if English is not their first language, asking the perpetrator to do the translation. Well, that's crazy. You know, but it's because they don't take the elderly person's word for it. You know, oh, they're old. Maybe their mind's not working right, you know.
And in your, and as far as policy and legislation, have you felt that ageism has had an impact on the ability to get things through or get the leaders involved?
I do. I do believe that. You know, I don't want to say that everybody wakes up every day hating old people and wants to do bad things to old people. But I do, again, ageism, when I go to government officials, it's the air we breathe. And it's not, if you look at where investment of public dollars is going now from city and state, it's not going to the fastest growing demographic, which is older adults. And by the way, if it doesn't, it's also not helping their families and the caregivers. It's going to youth, and it's not that youth don't need it, whether it's education or after-school programs. But there needs to be a balance. You govern a whole city. And so how do we balance that out? And I think that some of that, again, is are older adults worth investing in? I think that's a question that, whether it's consciously asked or not, I think it's in the background. And by the way, I think that affects private funding, whether it's foundations or corporate funding. Again, are older adults worth investing in? And as we often see, it's very hard. There are very few foundations that really concentrate on aging. So how do we move forward as a country when we're in the middle of an aging tsunami? How long can we keep denying this? And that it's not bad that people grow old. You know, that they're very functional old people that are contributing as well. So that's, I believe that's a lot of the struggle of ageism.
And, yeah, thank you, that was great. Do you want a glass of water?
Yeah, actually, that would be good, thank you.
You know, I know you watched the, or maybe you want to tell me before we start, like, how would you want to connect the vignette that you saw to advocacy?
Well, I think where it connects is trying, when we've won more money, prevented cuts, and then won more money for elder abuse victim services, because the legislation,
So why don't we just start,
yeah, it doesn't quite fit that particular
no, that's
situation.
Fine, that's fine.
So,
Just say,
okay.
you know, for example,
Right.
The mother in the vignette or the clip that I watched,
Right.
you know, could be someone who, you know,
Right.
in our advocacy, you know,
will benefit from
Right.
the service.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Sure.
how could, you know, I know you watched the video clip, the video segment, and do you see a connection between your advocacy and the mother in that?
I watched the video clip a few times of the mother and her son in that situation. I have to say, each time I watch it, it's like, it's painful. And this is why we do the advocacy. I mean, the connection is direct. We advocate for funding for elder abuse victim services so that a social worker and a lawyer, possibly, could intervene and help this family. Certainly protect the older adult for what was clear abuse, and possibly also help the son who had his own problems. And this is exactly why we do this advocacy. I mean, it's very direct. And I think one of the things in the future, I've been thinking about this more in the past few days actually, is we live in a very diverse city, and how you, not treat, but how you address ageism in diverse cultures is very challenging. Because what gets defined as elder abuse, how you talk to somebody, what the role of the family is, it's changing in this city because of, you know, whether it's immigrants or the LGBT population, or just people that have been here a while, you know, just the whole mix of New York City. You know, I think the challenges are going to be how we adapt our interventions to meet these cultural differences.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You had mentioned also, so I guess what I find interesting is how you you train, and how you train advocacy to professionals, and then how you also directly impact the older people themselves, and how you mobilize and train them. So I don't know if you can kind of talk about the different groups that you reach.
Sure. One of my favorite parts of my job is actually doing grassroots organizing. And the way we do it, our membership is very vast. We have members in every city council district, for example, in this city. So senior center, NORC programs, case management programs, the list, housing, the list goes on and on. And what we've done over the years is build advocacy into the culture of these programs. So if there's a budget cut, or this year we won new money, which was wonderful, we send out action alerts. We explain, this is what's happening, this is what you can do, this is our budget request. And then we do follow-up calls to the agencies because we know they're busy. Please pay attention to this. And you know what's happening now is when we send out alerts and we say, we need letters for this, the letters, they'll say, oh, we're already doing it, we're already on it. So we have really built that in. We brought 400 seniors to City Hall this past May for our 19th annual City Hall Advocacy Day. They met with 48 out of 51 of the council members. They were at a press conference. And by the way, the only people who spoke at the press conference, except for me moderating it, were older adults themselves. We've trained some senior activators, we call them. And so we empower these folks by teaching them advocacy hands-on. They understand it because it impacts their programs, therefore their life, and some people their jobs. So it's a very hands-on way of doing it. We're always available if there's any questions. And we have gotten feedback from our members that they like to be engaged in the advocacy and they really feel that they're learning. And so it seems to be a good model when you're looking at something across, you know, a large city like New York.
Mm-hmm. And how do people feel like they're making a difference?
I think where they see how people see they're making a difference, I can give you an example. When we do our City Hall Advocacy Day, senior citizens walk into the building to go meet, and when they come out, the feedback we get is they just feel great. I just met with my council member. I have never done this before. We tell them they can do it in whatever language they're comfortable in, as long as somebody translates for them, so that shouldn't stop them. Then they go back to their centers and we send another alert out, now follow up with a letter or a phone call. And so we hear from them that they really feel that direct impact. Plus, when we send out, again, these action alerts, we're always thanking them. We can't do this without you, you're our team, you're our partner, and we mean it. We can't do this without them. And the reason we either have prevented some cuts or won new money is because City Council and the mayor's side, they know there's a vast network out there and they know that we can bring them together. Yeah.
How have you seen this translate into impacting the budget?
Well, I think the advocacy did impact the budget. For the last 7 years or so, there were relentless budget cuts under the former mayor. And every year we were doing what's called the budget dance. The same cuts year after year, and you can't win. You're dancing in quicksand. You just can't win. And you certainly can't move ahead with growing need and cost of doing business. And so without this network, I can tell you, we would have had more senior centers closed. I think we would have lost all the elder abuse money, which we did manage to hold on to some, and now we've won more. There wouldn't have been a voice at City Hall for older adults without this network. And I can tell you that the voice at City Hall, on both sides of City Hall, from older adults, from programs, from advocates like me, is really needed, because there's not a lot of us folks doing this, and yet the population is growing in leaps and bounds. And so, again, I can't begin to tell you how valuable it is that we have a grassroots, we have people across the city, the grassroots, that in their own language, literally, can say what the problem is, what they want, what they need.
You know, I've been impacted by, you know, the role that you play, and how there's so few of you, the advocates in this field,
Right.
you know, from the conversation, or at least in this city. I'm not sure what's going on nationally, but so what would, if you had a vision for advocacy or people being trained in advocacy, you know, what would your dream be, or how would you see that?
I guess my dream of advocacy, first of all, would be more advocates that really focus on aging issues, on community-based aging issues that keep people in the community, per se. But I think what we need to do is place that aging in everything. So, for example, we have wonderful immigrant advocacy groups in this city, but they're not talking about elderly immigrants. Or, as I mentioned about domestic violence, and they are beginning, but how do we incorporate elder abuse and domestic violence? Or in affordable housing, I'm in coalitions with folks who talk about affordable housing. How do we make sure that the needs of affordable housing of older New Yorkers is included? My dream is that someday I won't be at that table and somebody else will say, what about older adults? Because right now, if I'm not there, or somebody like me, I mean, not just me, or somebody like me that's into advocating for older adults is not at the table, I'm not convinced it will ever get raised. And I see that it doesn't unless someone like me does. So my dream is that when you reach whatever that magic age is, 60, 65, or whatever, that somehow you're not floating off on your own, that you put out to sea somehow, that you remain part and parcel of the advocacy work that goes on in the city and state. Council of Senior Centers and Services, through my advocacy, plays the role of bringing a broad array of players in the elder abuse world together. So they could be social service providers, they could be from the medical world, government, DA offices, lawyers. Some of them don't feel comfortable doing advocacy. First of all, they may have a contract with the city, so they feel like, oh, will that get threatened? So how do we bring everybody together in a coalition where it gives them enough of a safe space, in a sense almost like cover, but it gives them enough of a safe space to come out with a position, to say this is what we want, or this is what we don't want, whether it's a budget cut or new money, for example, or legislation. And that's the purpose of coalition, is that you can bring a wide array of people together that can feel safe coming up with positions and priorities that they can't do on their own. And it really is also the old thing of you can't fight City Hall on your own. You just can't. I don't care how big you are, you really can't. And so, again, how do we bring the grassroots, the professionals, the older adults, and other allies? How do we use the media? How do we bring this all together to tell the story and to get the results we're advocating for? So that's the value of having a coalition and having us to run it in the sense that this is our expertise, this is what we do. What we bring to the table are all the connections we have with City Hall, with the elected officials at City Council or in the state. We're bringing all that to bear, and now we're doing it on behalf of elder abuse.
Right. And it's not only elder abuse, though. It's all services for the elder.
We have, in addition to advocating for elder abuse, we are now doing a lot of work on affordable senior housing, on community-based services, on anti-hunger, nutrition issues. We have a very wide array of issues that we work on. And when you look at the total picture, it's really, what does it take for somebody to age in New York City in the community?
And just to delve a little into what Sarah had brought up, I'm just curious, is there the fear that an organization or agency might have about kind of stepping out and advocating for something, kind of the person that, against the person who's kind of supporting their salary? Is that real? Is that
it is real? It is real, actually. There's often this concern among social service providers that contract with the Department for the Aging or another city or state agency that if they speak up and do advocacy, they're putting their contract at risk. I think, again, the value of a coalition is that you're joining a group. It's not just you. And I have to say, I have never seen anyone lose their contract because of doing advocacy. I have seen agencies grow because they do advocacy, because they become better known. They attend meetings where they get all the information they need that they might not have known, or they attend a meeting and they meet that right person, in whether it's Department for the Aging or some other city agency, say, oh, I really need to talk to you about my agency. Well, they've just made the connection. So I've really never seen advocacy hurt an agency. I've actually seen it help it. But I understand the fear, I certainly do. And so there are times when I will talk to staff at agencies and say, here's what I can say, and here's what you can say. and then we play our 2 roles. And they're usually pretty comfortable with that. I do have to respect. And mind you, within that, I'm always pushing the envelope a little bit to get them a little more comfortable, and usually it works. But I understand that, and I do have to respect their view on that, so.
Great. Thank you. And was there something on elder abuse that you had mentioned when we took the break that maybe there was something else on elder abuse that you wanted to bring up?
No, I was actually asking you, did I focus enough in everything I said on elder abuse? I don't know if there was anything I need to add, or because we talked about advocacy in general, and I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you did.
Okay.
I think this is incredible. I mean, I really do. I mean, we do have to edit it to 5 minutes.
I can add one more thing, and
Sure.
then whatever you want to, because I'm not sure if I really specifically said this.
Good.
We did our 19th annual City Hall Advocacy Day this year, where 400 seniors met with 48 out of 51 council members. We had senior activators that we trained to speak at our press conference on elder abuse. We had elder abuse funding in the agenda of the meetings with the council members. So everybody who attended those meetings were given briefing points. They all had elder abuse. So it was an educational tool, not just for the council members, but for the senior citizen participants. And that's another way we raise awareness. Plus, just one more thing, we did our 4th annual World Elder Abuse Advocacy Day press conference in June, which is right in the middle of the city budget process. And so once again, who spoke there were older adults. They weren't victims. We still had a lot of trouble getting people to speak publicly, but we had older adults speaking. We know we had some elder abuse victims present, and they stood off to the side. And I think they came because they felt supported. We also, for the first time, had a speaker from the New York Police Department, which was wonderful. So this is how advocacy over time builds that awareness, and of course we hope ends up in money. But it's also to show you how we incorporated older adults and the issue of elder abuse in everything we did on the city level.
And just curious how the older adults who are advocating for the victims of abuse, how did it affect them personally?
It has an impact. It's very interesting. The older adults who advocated on behalf of elder abuse victims, we had one gentleman who lives in senior housing, and this was 2 years ago. We asked him to speak at the press conference. So he went around and he spoke to some of the staff in the building and said, "Is there elder abuse here?" Because he said, "What do I know? I didn't know." And he heard about stories where people's Social Security checks were getting stolen or they weren't being treated properly. And he was very touched by it. He said, "Oh my God, I didn't know any of this stuff went on in my building," because it's senior housing. You think you're going to be safe. And then we had a woman who attended the vigil that the Downstate Coalition does, which is a domestic violence, it's actually a crime victims coalition. And she went to this vigil they do every year, and she shared with our staff person at the time that she stood up when they said, "Have you been impacted by a crime?" It turned out her son was murdered like maybe 20 years ago, and she never talked about it to anybody. And the vigil, she was so touched that she stood up and shared that, and that was, obviously a breakthrough for her. So you never know, even on an individual level, with people doing the advocacy. She was a senior activator, and what it can mean in their lives. And then somebody else came to us and said, "Oh, I know this is going on in my church, and nobody wants to talk about it." So we're trying to encourage them to raise it in their church. So it has a ripple effect, because at the end of the day, the best advocacy you could do is grassroots. How you influence people, in local communities, local neighborhoods, I believe that that's how you grow the message and the awareness.
And just interesting, because you touched on it we talked about it earlier about social work. I know when I was in graduate school, we had a kind of a separate track option of community organizing.
Which you don't anymore even have that.
Okay, so
Not
I'm just
really.
kind of curious,
Well,
where do you
it's a
see,
mix.
how do you see professionals growing into this?
I have an MSW from Ohio State University. I got my MSW in 1972. This was a very different time, and I majored in group work and community organizing at the time. I was never clinical. I think over time the social work profession has, and we all know this, over time the social work profession has morphed into clinical. It's morphed, you know, into wanting to be, whether it's private therapists or therapists with an agency. And it's gotten away from what I think was the reason social work even first came into existence, which was community organizing and speaking out on behalf of poor people, vulnerable people. And there are some schools that offer some tracks on what, I don't know if they call it administration and policy, but some schools don't really at all. And I think it's a real loss to our profession. I think there are other professionals or other individuals that are filling that vacuum. They'll have different kinds of degrees, they'll come out of, you know, the front lines of communities, but it's not necessarily social workers. And what I always encourage, whether it's interns I have or my colleagues, is join a coalition. Whether it's in your local community, it's you know, an elder abuse coalition. If you don't know the environment that your client is coming out of when that you meet with them in your office, you're doing them a disservice. If you're not working to try to impact that environment in a positive way, then I believe you're not doing your full job, because spending that hour with the person might be wonderful and terrific work is taking place and they feel safe, and that's all good. But they go back into that, they go back into that world. And so how do we impact elder abuse? How do we impact ageism? How do we impact, you know, poverty among the elderly? How do we impact all of this in addition to the day-to-day work? The day-to-day work is very important. That's the money I fight for all the time. But how do we impact the bigger picture? And I really feel that social work has seriously stepped back from that. I don't know if there's a rethinking, you know, in the academic and the universities, but I can see that people are not trained in this. They're just not trained. Well, so I'll train them. But,
Boy, that's a real loss.
It is a loss. I really believe it is. You know, it all came out of this social work. A lot of it came out of the settlement movement, and Jane Addams, right? She was the settlement movement in Chicago. You know, it really came out of that. Really, not just providing the services, you know, for the immigrants in the settlements, but really looking, you know, Jacob Riis, you know, really looking at the poverty and how do we speak on a bigger level than just the individual level. And I'm not really seeing that now.
I didn't realize that those.
I have a hard time getting students. I mean, I always manage to get students and they have a good experience, but just as there's not enough geriatric fellows and doctors, there's not a lot of students going into aging, period, but if you get to the policy advocacy side, it's even thinner. So, yeah.
Wow, that's really interesting. And then how do people learn? How do they find their mentors?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, actually something I've been thinking about recently, but I don't know how to do this and what time I'll have, but I would like to start maybe mentoring a small group of like interns that maybe I've had in the past, and maybe there'd be others that could be identified, and I don't quite know what that would look like. I'd have to figure that out, but
Yeah.
you know, but and there's others who could do this, not just me, but it's a gap. It's a real gap.
Right.
It's really a gap, yeah. And I think, by the way, it might be true for even if you're doing young people. I think a lot of it's become very clinically oriented in social work, and not just old people, and not the policy and the advocacy side. Now, maybe there's a shift happening when you're out in the field more, because there's been so many relentless budget cuts that people are catapulted into having to do advocacy. You know, so there might be somewhat of a shift for that.
And what is the connection with the politics, the political world, like with, you know, political groups that are advocating for certain things?
I'm sorry, the connection.
You know, if there's a Democratic platform that, you know, is there a connection sometimes with people who are mobilized to?
Oh, you mean to like endorse a candidate?
Yeah.
My organization doesn't endorse candidates. Actually, NASW does endorse candidates. They have a PAC, but we don't. So I don't know of any group in the city and state that endorses candidates that has to do with aging. Yeah, we don't. No. It's expensive and a tricky road to go down.
Right. No, I just meant some of
Yeah.
the grassroots organizing for some of those issues. Yeah, it's really, I wonder about the literature and the academic kind of thinking and research. I guess that's kind of probably taken, you know, there was kind of a movement 20, 30 years ago with more models being developed and written about it and so forth.
In terms of
Community organizing.
I don't know about the literature of community organizing in recent times. I honestly, you know, when I entered social work school in 1972, that was the fall, right? I graduated in 1970. The spring of 70 was Kent State and the invasion of Cambodia. I went to Hunter. We had no graduation. We closed the school down. It was one building then. It wasn't a big deal. But even the campus of Ohio State, there had been fires and riots or whatever you want to call it, rallies. And it was, so when I got there, it was almost deadly quiet because they'd really gone through a lot, especially in the state of Ohio at the time. That was the time I was going to social work school, coming out of the 60s, you know. It's just it's different now. But there are other people who fill the gap. For example, all these immigrant groups doing advocacy, the Dreamers, you know, they're doing it. They don't have MSWs.
Right.
They're doing it. So somebody will fill that gap. And I'm sure there are social workers involved in that. I don't want to say they're not. But again, as a profession, I really think we've taken a step back from being in the leadership of that. And I'm hoping we can begin to come somewhat full circle in terms of recognizing that because government has pulled back so much on funding services, that we need to be out. That because government keeps pulling back on funding services, that social workers need to be on the front lines of advocacy. Yeah.